On a cold Saturday evening just before 9:00 p.m., the knock came. It was the kind of sound that shifts the air in a house, sharp and deliberate, the kind that makes your chest tighten before you even know why. I had been folding laundry on the sofa, humming to myself, waiting for Daniel to walk through the door. Instead, when I opened it, two officers stood under the porch light, their hats in their hands, faces heavy with something I didn't want to hear. One spoke my name gently, and before the words fully formed, I already knew. Daniel had suffered a heart attack while driving home. He had lost control of the car. He didn't make it. The room tilted. I clutched the frame of the door as though it could hold me up when the world itself was falling. Their voices reached me, but like echoes from underwater. All I could see was Daniel's smile, the way his eyes crinkled when he teased me, the sound of his footsteps on the porch that would never come again. By the time the officers guided me back to the sofa and eventually left, the house was thick with silence. I called Claire, my daughter, because instinct told me she would come. She answered after the third ring, her voice hurried, distracted, the kind of tone that belonged to someone halfway across the world already. When I told her that her father was gone, there was a pause, but not the kind of pause grief brings. Instead, she sighed with annoyance. She had already booked her trip, she explained. $10,000? Non-refundable? She couldn't cancel for this. His death, she said, was my problem. The phone felt heavier than stone in my hand as her words settled. My problem, not hers. The line went dead, and the shadows in the living room stretched longer, as if to remind me that I was alone. The days that followed blurred into a haze of calls and arrangements. I chose a casket, hymns, and a framed photograph of Daniel in his favorite navy suit. Though every choice carved into me as if I were chiseling away pieces of my own heart. Neighbors dropped off casseroles and friends offered help. But the only person I wanted beside me, the daughter I had carried, raised, and sacrificed for, remained absent at the funeral. I stood in the back for a moment, watching as colleagues, cousins, and neighbors gathered. Their tears and kind words offered comfort, yet the empty chair at the front row where Claire should have been burned like a wound. While the pastor spoke of Daniel's kindness, my hands clasped tighter. My whispered goodbye drowned beneath the void her absence created. When I returned home after the service, the quiet was unbearable. The scent of lilies clung to me, and I stared at the mugs Daniel and I used each morning. One of them chipped at the rim his favorite. I remembered how many times Claire had urged me to throw it away. Yet I never could. Sitting alone, I thought of the years I had carried her burdens without question. The night shifts, the extra bookkeeping jobs so she could go to college without debt. The car I co-signed, the payments I ended up covering when excuses piled up. Rent checks slipped into her hand. Grocery bills I absorbed without hesitation. Every sacrifice disguised as love until she believed it was her right. And now, when it mattered most, she was drinking champagne somewhere far away. A few days later, my laptop flickered open to her vacation photos. Claire stretched across a poolside chair, a cocktail balanced in her hand. Her captions were smug, declaring life too short not to enjoy. Each image drove the truth deeper into me. She had chosen herself, chosen indulgence, chosen to abandon the family her father had built with such devotion. The anger that rose gave way to something colder clarity. That night, I pulled out Daniel's old leather ledger, his neat pencil lines still marking past records. On a fresh page, I began listing every payment I had covered for Claire over the years: her car loan, her phone bill, her insurance, her rent, even her streaming services. The numbers grew quickly: $2,500 every month for years. The sum startled me, not just in what it revealed financially, but in what it proved emotionally. My sacrifices had turned into her entitlement, my generosity into her expectation. Daniel's voice echoed in my mind. He had always told me I gave too much, that love should not leave me empty. "You can't carry her forever, Eve," he would say. And now, with the ledger open before me, I realized he had been right all along. The next morning, I canceled her payments one by one. Her phone bill, her car loan, her insurance, all gone with a click. My hands didn't tremble. Instead, they steadied. It wasn't revenge, it was release. Later, I changed the locks on the rental property she claimed as hers, though she had never paid a cent toward it. The polished steel key in my purse felt like a new chapter written in my palm. When Claire returned from her trip, her pounding on my door shook the glass. She stormed inside, fury dripping from every word. She accused me of ruining her life, of making her suffer. But as she raged, I remained calm. I reminded her of her words when Daniel died, how she had said his death was my problem, not hers. She spat accusations back, insisting I was jealous, bitter, clinging to ghosts. And then, with a cruel sneer, she dropped her final blow. She was pregnant, and I couldn't stand that her life was beginning while mine was ending. For a moment, her cruelty pressed like a blade against me. But instead of cutting, it clarified. I met her eyes and told her the truth. I was not alone. I was free. Her face faltered when I said the words. She had expected me to crumble, to break beneath the weight of her cruelty. But I didn't. I had already broken when Daniel's body was lowered into the ground, and since then I had pieced myself together into something steadier. Claire sputtered with fury, accusing me of being jealous of her happiness, of wanting her to suffer because I was suffering. She threw her arms about, her voice rising like a storm that filled the house. But underneath it, I heard something else: fear. For the first time in her life, she realized I would not bend. I stood calm, my hands folded, and told her plainly that I would no longer pay her bills, no longer carry her debts, no longer sacrifice my dignity for a daughter who could look at her father's grave and call it someone else's problem. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in years, she had no script. She shouted that I couldn't cut her off, that she was my daughter, as though blood alone bound me into servitude. I replied softly, with a sadness that carried more weight than anger ever could, that this was the saddest part of all. The silence that followed was heavier than her shouting had been. When she finally stormed out, muttering, slamming the door behind her, the stillness that settled in the house was not suffocating. It was liberating. I thought that might be the end of it, but Claire wasn't finished. A week later, her words appeared on social media, long posts painting herself as the victim. She wrote that I had abandoned her while she was pregnant, that I had thrown her out without reason, that I was cruel and bitter. For a moment, shame burned in me. The same shame I had carried for years when I paid her bills quietly so no one would know she had failed again. But then the comments started. Friends and neighbors spoke up. Richard and Lorna reminded her and everyone else that they had stood by me at Daniel's funeral. while she was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Lam from church wrote gently but firmly that Claire had told them herself she couldn't come because of her vacation. And then others began sharing the photos Claire had posted: her cocktail glasses, her shopping bags, her laughter on the beach on the very days her father was laid to rest. Her story crumbled in real time. I didn't need to defend myself because the truth was already there, written in her own captions, etched in the memories of those who had witnessed my solitude. Claire deleted her post within hours, but the damage was done. Not to me, but to her. The whispers spread, and for the first time, I was not the one carrying the burden of shame. She had exposed herself. 2 weeks later, I opened the door one evening to the smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter. Richard and Lorna stood there with a casserole, and behind them came Mrs. Lam with a pie. They stepped into my kitchen, filling the house with warmth. We sat at the dining table that had once felt so painfully empty and filled it with food, stories, and the clinking of forks against china. I poured coffee, listened to laughter, and felt something I hadn't in months: belonging. These people weren't here out of obligation. They weren't tallying debts or expecting repayment. They came because compassion was part of who they were. As the night wound down and they left with hugs and gentle words, I stood at the door, breathing in the cool air behind me. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It was alive again. And in that moment, I realized something I had resisted for so long: family is not defined by blood, but by love. Claire had walked away, but in doing so, she made room for others to step in, people who showed up without condition. The following weeks taught me the meaning of quiet strength. I took long walks in the mornings, passed by Daniel's favorite park bench, and whispered his name to the trees. I cooked simple meals for myself and learned the pleasure of eating without rushing. I even returned to my bookkeeping, not because I needed the money, but because routine steadied me. And every Sunday, I went to church. At first, the whispers about Claire stung. But over time, I understood they weren't about me. They were about her choices, and those were hers alone to carry. When I thought of Claire, I no longer felt the sharp edge of anger. What I felt was acceptance. I had loved her, given her everything, and when she turned her back on me in my darkest hour, she revealed who she truly was. It was not my job to fix her. Not anymore. She would have to face herself and the world without the cushion of my sacrifices. Still, there were moments when the weight of loss pressed hard against me. In the evenings, I would sit with Daniel's ledger open, running my fingers across the faded pencil lines. His words echoed in my memory, gentle and firm. You can't carry her forever. Eve. And now, at last, I understood. Love doesn't mean carrying someone until you collapse. It means knowing when to let go. Spring came quietly, the air warming, blossoms appearing on trees that had stood bare during the winter of my grief. I began opening the curtains each morning, letting the light spill into the house instead of sitting in darkness. With each day, I felt less like a widow drowning and more like a woman reclaiming her place in the world. Daniel's absence still ached, but it no longer hollowed me. It became part of me, a reminder of a love that had been real and enduring. What hurt more was Claire's absence, but even that wound had begun to scar over. No longer raw, no longer bleeding. I saw her name only occasionally now: whispers at church, a photograph on someone else's feed. Each time, the image felt more distant, like a person I once knew, but who no longer belonged in my life. She had chosen herself, chosen indulgence, and chosen to paint me as the villain in her story. But I no longer felt the need to correct her version of events. The truth was written in the silence between us, in the empty chair at her father's funeral, in the ledger that showed years of debts carried on my shoulders. One morning, I visited the cemetery with fresh lilies. The grass was damp, the sky a soft blue, and I knelt beside Daniel's grave, brushing my hand across the stone. I told him everything, the pain, the betrayal, the clarity I had gained. "You were right," I whispered. "I gave too much, but I see it now, and I'm learning to live differently." I stayed there for a long time, not weeping, but speaking softly as though he could hear. When I stood, I felt lighter, as though the ground itself had absorbed my sorrow and left me steadier. Later that week, I received a letter in the mail addressed in Claire's handwriting. My heart tightened as I opened it, unsure of what I would find. Inside were words that surprised me, not apologies, not admissions of guilt, but demands. She accused me of cruelty, of abandoning her in her time of need, of stealing what she believed was hers. She wrote that, as her mother, I owed her support, especially now that she was expecting a child. Her words were sharp, dripping with entitlement, and yet, as I read them, I felt no sting. Instead, I felt a calm certainty that I owed her nothing more. I placed the letter in Daniel's ledger, between the pages where I had listed her debts, and closed it. That was where it belonged, among the records of what had been given and never repaid. I would not answer her, not in ink, not in voice. My silence would be my reply. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how the community continued to rally around me. Richard and Lorna stopped by often, sometimes with food, sometimes just with conversation. The women at church invited me to join their book club, and though at first I hesitated, I found myself laughing with them one evening, the sound strange and freeing. Even the grocer down the street, who had known Daniel for years, started setting aside my favorite bread so it wouldn't sell out. These small acts reminded me that kindness still existed, that life still offered connection even when family faltered. Claire, meanwhile, faded further. Stories of her extravagance continued to leak out her shopping sprees, her complaints about being cut off, her anger at those who no longer believed her tales. Once, such gossip would have embarrassed me, but now I understood it was hers to own. People were beginning to see her clearly, without my shield to protect her. And though I wished she might learn humility, I no longer felt responsible for teaching her. One Sunday after service, Mrs. Lam took my hand and said softly, "You've carried enough. Eve, let others carry you for a while." Her words sank deep, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe I deserved it. That evening, when I sat at my dining table with friends who had become like family, I realized the emptiness I once feared was gone. The house was still quiet, yes, but it no longer felt lonely. It felt mine. There are still nights when grief wakes me, when I reach for Daniel in the dark and find only cold sheets. But even then, I remind myself of the lesson his death carved into me. Love is not about losing yourself. Love, real love, should give strength, not strip it away. And though I cannot rewrite the years I spent carrying Claire, I can write the years ahead differently. Summer settled in with long evenings and golden light. The kind Daniel used to love when he'd sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea. I found myself drawn there too, resting in his chair as the sun slipped lower. The cicadas humming. The air still carried the ache of absence, but I was no longer crushed by it. I had grown used to speaking softly into the dusk, telling Daniel about my day, about the casserole Richard's wife brought over, about the way the roses bloomed brighter than ever that year. I imagined he would smile, that familiar crinkle at the corner of his eyes, and tell me I was stronger than I thought. It was during one of those evenings that Claire returned again, though not in person this time. She left another message, this one on my voicemail. Her tone was sharp, brittle with rage, demanding money, insisting she had a right to it. She invoked the pregnancy again, spitting the word like it should bind me to her demands. I listened to her words, every accusation, every guilt-laden phrase, and then I pressed delete. My finger hovered for a moment, not out of hesitation, but because the act itself felt final. For years I had bent under the weight of her voice. That night, I erased it, and with it, the last chain I had let her hold. Not long after, neighbors began sharing more stories. Some had seen Claire arguing loudly in the street. Others spoke of debts she had left unpaid now that my hand was no longer steadying her. It pained me to hear it, but I did not interfere. She had chosen her path, and I would not step onto it again. The lesson was cruel, but clear enabling had not saved her. It had only delayed the moment when she would face her own reflection. Now, at last, she had to. Meanwhile, my life grew richer in the simplest of ways. I took on small bookkeeping projects again, not for survival, but for the quiet satisfaction of keeping numbers in order. I joined the church choir, my voice rusty but welcomed. I discovered that laughter could live in me again when friends gathered around my table. We told stories late into the night, and I realized something Daniel had always known. Love is not about bloodlines. It is about presence. There were moments, of course, when memory pierced through, sharp and unexpected. Passing the hardware store where Daniel had once bought tools, hearing a song he loved while grocery shopping, finding an old note tucked into a book. Each time, the grief returned, but it no longer left me undone. I carried it the way one carries a scar tender, but no longer bleeding. And each time it came, I reminded myself that it was the price of having loved deeply, and that price was worth paying. By autumn, the whispers about Claire had shifted from gossip to resignation. People no longer spoke of her with shock, but with pity. Her attempts to twist the truth had lost their power. The lies she spun unraveled against the weight of her own actions. I remained silent, never adding to the chorus, never defending myself. The truth had defended me enough. On the anniversary of Daniel's passing, I visited the cemetery once more. This time, I didn't bring lilies. I brought the chipped mug he had loved so much. I placed it gently at the base of the stone, smiling through tears. "You always said I held on to too much," I whispered. "Maybe now I can let go." The wind moved through the trees as though in answer, and I felt, for the first time, that goodbye was not an end, but a beginning. As I walked back to the car, I thought about the journey behind me, a husband gone too soon, a daughter who turned away when love mattered most. And yet, through it all, I had found a strength I never knew I had, a community that stood beside me, and a peace that came from finally drawing a line where one was needed. The house I returned to that evening was quiet. Yes, but not empty. It was filled with echoes of laughter shared, meals eaten, prayers spoken, and a future unfolding. A future that belonged to me. Winter came again. Crisp air settling over the town. Frost tracing the windows of the house that had once felt unbearably hollow. This time, though, the silence inside did not suffocate me. It carried warmth, the kind built from evenings filled with friends' laughter, from songs sung in the church choir, from casseroles shared across my dining table. The void that Claire had left no longer ached the same way it had been filled, not perfectly, but gently, by people who showed up out of love rather than obligation. Claire's name still surfaced now and then, her stories drifting back through whispers, but they no longer pierced me. I had stopped following, stopped searching. She was still spinning her tales, still painting herself as the victim, but the world had seen too much of the truth. Her friends had grown weary of her excuses, her debts, her cruelty. She had carved her own reputation, and I no longer carried the burden of protecting her from it. That weight, once crushing, was gone. One evening, I sat with Daniel's ledger open before me, the old leather softened with age. I turned through the pages of neat pencil lines until I reached the sheet where I had written Claire's debts. Each payment I had covered, each sacrifice I had made. The numbers once overwhelmed me, but now they felt like something else, a record not of failure, but of lessons. A reminder of where blind love can lead, and how important it is to draw boundaries before you are emptied. I closed the book and placed it back in the drawer, no longer needing it to remind me who I had been or what I had endured. In the months that followed, I continued to discover small joys, planting bulbs in the garden for the spring, taking long walks at sunrise when the air was still and the world felt new, inviting neighbors for tea without worrying about appearances. I realized that for years I had measured love by sacrifice, by how much of myself I could give away. Now, I measured it by presence, by honesty, by reciprocity, and for the first time, I began to understand what it meant to be free. On Daniel's birthday, I invited friends over. We raised glasses in his memory, shared stories that made us laugh until tears rolled down our cheeks. And I felt him there with us, not in sorrow, but in joy. I knew he would have been proud that I had finally let go of the chains I had wrapped around myself for Claire's sake. Proud that I had chosen to live, not just to endure. Life had not given me what I expected. I never imagined burying my husband so soon. Never imagined my daughter turning her back on me. Never imagined starting over when I thought my years of struggle were long past. But life had also given me resilience, and a truth I wished I had learned sooner. Family is not defined by blood, but by love. Some bonds lift you, others break you, and sometimes the bravest act of love is to let go. If you've stayed with me through this story, I hope you carry this lesson too. Love is not about emptying yourself to fill someone else's cup. Love is about walking together, supporting one another when it matters most, and knowing when it's time to draw a line. Because peace does not come from clinging to those who wound you. It comes from opening your heart to those who truly care. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Your support helps keep these stories alive and reminds us that we are never as alone as we fear.